Hello, my name is Xander. Welcome back to the Python Beginners course. Here we're going to cover random. So more often or not, we want to select a random number or a random item from a list, for example. This is part 6 of the Python Beginners course. If you have missed any of the other tutorials, you'll find a link in the video description, and that would take you back to any of the modules that you want to have a look at. In order for us to perform some random events here in Python, we need to import it from a library. So import random. So that's going to give us access to the random tools that's going to enable us to generate random numbers or to select random items. So Python can generate random values. In reality, the values are not completely random, some would suggest, as computers can't generally cope with random. Instead, we're using an incredibly complex algorithm that makes it virtually impossible to accurately predict its outcome. So in effect, it acts as a random function. So let's give this a go. Right, so let's create X and let's just generate a random number. So we're going to use random, and now we're going to use the tools within random. So here we're just going to use random again. So this is going to generate, as it suggests here, a variable. Sorry, it's going to generate a number between 0 and 1. Okay, so it's a float. Okay, so between 0 and 1. So that's what we're going to store. So let's just print that and see that in action. There we go. So you can see as I keep doing this, we're just generating a number between 0 and 1. Okay, so we probably want to control this, and there are plenty of different ways for us to do that. So let's first of all move now over to a second example. So we've seen a float. Let's see if we can now generate a random integer, for example. So let's go with X again. So X is now going to equal random. So we're bringing random in again, and this time we're going to have a rad for random integer. So we're going to now create or try and generate a random integer. So let's see if it performs in the same way. Okay, so you can see that there are two missing required positional arguments. So A and B. So what are they? So those are two numbers. That is going to be our range that we're going to utilize to generate. So here we're going to generate a number. So let's just do 0 and 1, for example. I'll just show you this first. So here we've defined a range. Now notice that we're just going to generate 0 or 1. So we can obviously expand that and to 100, for example. So now we can generate a random number between these values. Okay. So we can perform a similar operation if we were to turn this into, for example, uniform. Okay, so here we're going to generate a float between the two values. So far we've got three tools. Random for a random number between 0 and 1, and that can be really useful for many different situations where we want some general randomness, but we don't need to specify a number. So in addition to that, we have random float, and we've seen now a random integer. So let's have a look at a third example here. We're going to utilize random rad range. So this time we're going to have one parameter here, just 100. Let's see this behavior. So you can see that if I just put this down to 1, just a better example. So you can see what's happening here is that I'm only producing 1. There's only one value. So in this case, the range is between 0 up to 1, but not 1. But here we're just outputting integers. So 2, that's going to provide a number between 0 and 1. So you can see how that is working up till 2, not 2 or including 2. So just in this case, 0 and 1 and so on. So it's important if you're going to use the rad range, the last number that you define here won't be utilized in the generation of numbers. Okay. So we can expand the parameters here. So we can define the starting number if we want to. So 0 start and stop. So we've got start and stop. You can see here that we've got an integer. So this is going to perform in the same way, 1 and 0 only. And what we can also do, let's just turn this into, for example, 101. Okay, and now what we want to do is get a random integer, but an even number. So here what we can do is define the steps. So in this case, 2. So that's going to produce a number between 0 and 100, and it's going to be an even integer that we're selecting. There we go. So we've got this third parameter here, which is steps. So what's worth having a looking through, because there's plenty of these as we work through random, is to have a look at some of the documentation for random, and that would take you to, or lead you towards, all the different functions we have available for random. So we'll cover a few more. Right, so far, all we've really looked at is generating random numbers. So we can also generate, for example, letters, or in actual fact, because if you remember, a string is an array of bytes, we can perform some interesting actions on strings. So let's just take in a string here. So x equals, for example, a string. Okay, so now let's apply random to this. So we can use random, and this time we're going to use choice. So we're going to make a random choice here from x. Now, you might be wondering what's going to happen here. Well, let's just remember that this string, we can break this down into, remember, an array of characters. So what's going to happen here in actual fact is going to print an individual character from this string. So let's give this a go. So we're going to select a random character from this string. There we go. So at this point, we've generated random numbers, integers, and floats, and we've seen how utilizing random on a string utilizing a choice will return a single character. So more often than not, we want to select from, for example, a list. So let's just bring in a list here. So we've got a list of 3 items, rock, paper, and scissors, and we want to make a random choice. So before our selection on a string, it returned a single character. So we can perform random again, choice, on, for example, a list, and it will return 1 item from the list. So remember what's happening behind the scenes here is that each list has a position, if you like, 0, position 1, and position 2. So whereas before the individual characters here had a position when we use choice, now here in a list we have these whole strings which correlate to positions in our list. So we're basically just going to select a position in our list randomly and then return the string. So let's bring in our item list here. So let's just give this a go. We'll output a random item from our list. And there we go. So that's selecting random items from a list. What if we wanted to select more than 1 item from a list, for example? Well, let's just bring in this list of numbers here, integers. And what we're going to do here is let's just select more than 1. So what we have here is a random dot sample. Okay, so instead of choice being 1, we now have sample. So here we're going to take in x, that's the data we want to select from, and now we can choose how many we want to select. So 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 items. So let's just select 2 from this list here. So we can now just print that out. Okay, so let's just print it out as it is. You can see what happens here is that we can see the brackets and the numbers, and that's not always ideal. So we can remove that. Let's utilize, for example, a star, and that then brings or returns back just the numbers, which can be a little bit more ideal if you're going to print this out. Right, so we can expand upon that, remember, because if you remember, print allows us to use the separator tool. So let's just go ahead and separate that with a comma, for example. And now what we have is a nice separation. Let's get rid of that space if you want to. So you can remove the space if that's something that you want to do. And of course, also what we could do is we could go ahead and put them on separate lines if we wanted to, of course. So there we have a run through of some of the really common tools that you might want to use from the random library. Now, obviously I've just run through these. And if you look at the GitHub repository, there's a sample or example of everything we've done so far. Now, the best way to practice or to establish and learn these tools is to actually put them into some sort of context. So let's now have a look at some challenges where we can apply some of these random commands, functions. So let's take a look at challenge number 1. Here we're going to create a random number game. So we're going to ask the user to input a number between 1 and 10. Then we're going to generate a random number between 1 and 10 and check to see if the users and the random number matches. If they do, we're going to notify the user they've won. Else we're going to ask the user to try again. So have a look at the challenge, have a go, and then I'll go through the solution. Right, so let's have a look at a solution. So we're going to need to import the random, so it just keeps that there in actual fact. So now then, let's just use X. So we're going to have an input, so we're going to ask the user to input select a number between 1 and 10. Okay, so we ask the user to select a number between 1 and 10. Right, so now we're going to get the random number. So let's get that just as Y. So we're going to get a random number. So random dot, we're going to use the rad int. So random integer. That's going to be between 1 and 10. Okay, so you may need to just remind yourself about some of these different rules here. So let's just do 1 to 2. Let's just see what prints out. So let's just remove that slightly. Okay, so let's just print this out. So we're printing just 1 and 2. Okay, so the range here is 1 to 2. Okay, and not when we remember when we select a range, if we define 2 in our range, it's only going to select 0 and 1. So here we are selecting 1 and 2. So let's move that to 10. So just double check that. You can see that we are producing 10, so 1 till 10. So that's okay. So we are now generating a number between 1 and 10. Right, so now what we need to do is set out some general logic here. So if the integer, which is going to be X, that's the user's number, equals Y. So if the random number that's generated equals the same as the user's number, then we're going to print something. So a match made, for example. Else, we're just going to print try again, for example. Okay, so very simply put, the user types a number, we generate a random number, we check it, if it matches, if it does match, match is made. If we don't match it, we ask them to try again. Now I'm just going to change that to 2, just so it makes it easier for me to make a match. So 1, match is made, try again. Okay, so that was fairly simple. So let's move over now to challenge 2. It's the old classic rock, paper, scissors game. Now I do apologize if you don't know what the rock, paper, scissors game is. If you do, just skip ahead. If you don't, if I can just quickly explain this. Imagine there's 2 people, you're playing a game. You both randomly select rock, paper, or scissors. So for example, if the user selects rock and the other person selects rock, it's a draw. If someone selects rock and someone else selects paper, paper beats rock, and so on. So have a look online for the rules. I'm just going to take you through it. Like I said, I do apologize if you've not played this game before. So let's go ahead and have a look at a solution for this. So let's try and provide or generate an answer for this game. So rock, paper, or scissors. Right, so first of all, we're going to need an item list, I think. So let's just call this item list, underscore, of course. So we're going to create a list here, rock. So we're going to have 3 items, rock, paper, and scissors. Right, so that's our list. And what we're going to be doing here, of course, is randomly selecting one of these. So we're going to ask the user to choose. So we're going to ask the user to select, or just to type in rock, paper, or scissors. Okay, so the user types in rock, paper, or scissors. We now need to generate a random choice. So that's going to equal random. And then this time we're going to use choice. Now we are choosing from the item list. So here we're going to choose one item, because we're using choice, from our list here. So now what we have is the user's choice and the item, the random choice. So for the sake of our own sanity, let's just print out the CPU choice, or the computer selection. So we know what they selected, right? So we can do this in many ways, can't we? So let's just use F. So that's the user's, or sorry, that's the computer's choice, random selected. So at least we know what they've selected. Right, so let's create some statements here. Right, so I'm going to write this out. There are definitely better ways to do this, but I just want to make it as explicit as possible so we can see what's happening. So if choice, so if the user's choice is equal to, first of all, rock, then we're going to perform some actions. Right, so if the random choice is equal to rock, that means that the user and the random choice are both the same, in which case we're going to print a draw. Okay, so if any of the choices are the same, paper, scissors, or rock, then it's always going to be a draw. Now, based upon what I've just said there, we could probably capture that without writing all these if statements in actual fact, but we're just going to work this way. Right, so else if, okay, so else if the random choice is, for example, paper, then we're going to print something else. So if it's paper, then lose. You're going to lose. If you select rock, yeah, so you lose. Right. So with that said, we now can have another else if. So if the random choice is equal now to, for example, scissors, I'm going to print you win. Okay, so let's just put my semicolons. Okay, so what we can now do then is do the same thing for the paper choice. So here, if the random choice is rock and we've selected paper, or the user selected paper, they're going to win. Okay, so paper beats rock. And then else, if it's paper, that's a random choice, it's a draw. Else if it's scissors, then we lose. And now we can do the same thing for scissors. So if we have scissors and the random choice from the computer is rock, then we lose. If it's paper, we win. Else if it's scissors, it's a draw. Okay, so if, for example, none of these choices were made, rock, paper, or scissors, then we're just going to finish off with an else because they haven't selected anything that's valid. So let's just print something simple like you did not enter a valid option. There we go. Right. So now we have this kind of logic in place. Let's just give it a go. Right, so let's just type in rock. Okay, so the computer selected paper, so therefore paper beats rock, so I lose. So let's just go for paper. Oh, so error name random choice is not defined. Okay, so bear with me a second. I made a mistake with my naming. So these names are incorrect. So I'm just changing the variable name where the random choice is selected. Okay, so let's give this a go. Right, so paper. Okay, so the computer selected paper, it's a draw, and so on. So let's just type in something incorrect. There we go, we did not enter a valid option. So what would be really interesting here is if you could work out some better logic structure here for this application, because there's a lot of repetition here. And I've always already suggested one thing, in that we know that if choice equals random choice, then we know it's going to be a draw. So here we're printing out draw 3 times. So we could remove some of this code simply by building that check first, for example. So see if you can work out how to streamline, refactor this code in a smaller, succinct way for this application. So that brings us on to code challenge 3. So now we're going to create a lottery picker which picks and prints 6 numbers from a list provided. So here we're going to imagine it's a lottery situation. So we've got numbers, say 1 to 60. Now we're going to randomly select 6 of those numbers, which are going to be the winning numbers from the list, and display them. So let's just take a look at an existing example that we looked at previously in this tutorial. We had a set of numbers here, and we were utilizing random sample 2 items. So we can go ahead and extend this if we wanted to. Here I'm just going to select 4 numbers from this 10. You can follow the tutorial and generate some different numbers and some more numbers. So here what we want to do then is, let's just, for example, print this out. So this would help us generate the numbers that we need. So here I've selected 4 numbers, random numbers from our list here, and this is generating our lottery numbers. Obviously I could turn this into 6, just a case of changing the parameters there, and there we have our 6 lottery numbers. So there we have an introduction to Python's random generator, generating random numbers, selecting random items from a list, for example, and then we've seen how we can start to utilize this within applications. And as you might imagine, it's something that potentially you're going to use quite often, random, in certain situations. Now, there is, like all these topics, there's more to these topics, and I'm slowly introducing them to you. Now, the order that I've selected for this course means that we can't fully embellish at this point random, but we will be utilizing it later. Once we learn a little bit more about loops, for loops and while loops in module 8 and 9, we'll start to see how this feeds in more into our program utilizing random numbers. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully this was useful, and I hope to see you in the next module.